Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our June ProductTank event. My name is Janice and I'll be your host for this evening. I have my co-organizer here on screen with me. Matt, say hello.
Evening, everyone.
And we have Leon, who is our guest speaker. And Leon, hello. And I'll introduce Leon further in a moment. And out in the front of house, we have our other co-organizer, Neve, who will be helping to field questions for Leon later this evening. So first up, I would like to give a bit of an introduction to ProductTank for those who are not familiar with what ProductTank is. So ProductTank is the world's largest product community by product people for product people. It's now established in local communities in over 200 plus cities around the world. And we're part of the global professional network for product people known as Mind the Product. And together, the ProductTank community and Mind the Product professional network, our mission is really to make product people more successful by coming together to further our craft. There's lots of ways of getting involved in Mind the Product and the ProductTank community. If you wish to speak at a ProductTank, get in touch with one of the ProductTank organizers. You can host or sponsor a local ProductTank. And there's also opportunities to write for Mind the Product on mindtheproduct.com. There's lots of amazing content on there to help you further your craft. There's also an opportunity to become a Mind the Product member, and that gives you exclusive access to content from all the conferences. And there's also incredible short training courses. The most recent one that's been published is a short training course on jobs to be done by Joe Leach. And there's also coming up in July, on the 14th and 15th of July, there's Mind Product Digicon for the Americas. So again, look out for that if you'd like to get involved in the conference. So that's it with our introduction. All that's left now is to really introduce Leon. So Leon is product director at 383, and 383 is a digital product studio. It's an award-winning studio here in Birmingham. And we're really thrilled to have Leon on this evening. I know personally, I follow a lot of Leon's content that he puts out on LinkedIn and also on the 383 blog. I can highly recommend you guys connecting with that. There's some great thought leadership there around product thinking. And I guess without further ado, I will hand over to you, Leon, and you can take it away.
Perfect.
One second.
Cool. Right, so let's get myself set up here. There we go. Perfect. So thanks, Janice. And I'm Leon, product director at 383, and this is a talk about how we went from selling projects to products, and really the story of how we became a digital product studio. In this talk, there's three sort of key takeouts, really, I guess. So one is, what lessons do we learn the hard way and how do we overcome them? Two is, how do we switch to selling time versus selling features? This is probably the biggest sort of like transition in our thinking and how we get our clients to think. And thirdly is how we think in outcomes, circular thinking. I'm not going to go through all of the slides about 383, but I thought these next couple kind of gives you a bit of a sort of a flavour for who we are and how we think. So the first thing then is that we believe in making things that people want versus making people want things. And I guess this really has always been sort of core to the way that we've operated, by trying to understand how do we create compelling digital products and services versus trying to advertise, I guess, things that aren't that great. And rather than focusing on making people want things, if we focus on making things that people want, then ultimately we make better products and services. Second part then is we favour outcomes over outputs. So by that, what I mean is it can be tempting as an agency, a client comes to you with a list of requirements to jump straight into, okay, how do we go and build these things out, and doing work to kind of reduce down the risk of that going wrong. So that might be really great project planning, that might be some technical discovery, that might be some user frames and prototypes. But what we haven't really done is understood, if we launch this thing, is this thing going to have the impacts on our business that we think it will do? I.e., what is the outcome that we're looking for? And then how do we focus on that outcome and using that to drive the features versus starting at the features and trying to get back towards the outcome? And then we've got this one, which is about us wanting to learn in discovery versus delivery. And this is quite important. So a lot of the time, again, sort of in agency world, you're expected to know all of the answers. Prospects will come to us and say, well, you're the experts. Now, we don't know everything. What we do have, though, is a process of discovery that allows us to uncover what's important, what's valuable, and then it allows us to then go and deliver it. But this is a continuous cycle. So it's not one or the other, it's both together. So I think those kind of three things give you a little bit of background about 383. Obviously, if you want to find out more, go on the website. So let's get into this. Why have they changed? Bit of a warning. There's lots of GIFs coming up in this talk. Hopefully there's nothing that will give anybody any photosensitivity issues, but you've been warned. So the first bit then, who remembers this episode of The Simpsons where Homer gets to design a car? So if you're not seeing it, Homer discovers that he has a half brother called Herb who owns a car manufacturer. And Herb decides to ask Homer, who he thinks is like the average American man, to design the next car that they're going to release. So long story short, Homer adds all of these features that he would like and which he thinks everybody else would like, and ends up with a car that ultimately flops. Now, why am I telling you this? I guess this is a little bit like what it is like or was like for us in agency land. We've got clients coming to us with lots of ideas to which they think are going to be brilliant because that's what they would use. And essentially your task is to turn their idea into reality. And I guess the problem that we kind of found with this is that we'd put all this effort into building something that looked great, technically was brilliant, but ultimately flopped. It didn't quite hit the mark with people. And it can feel a little bit like this sometimes. The client's the customer, and it can feel like you're running around trying to please their every request. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that as a third party, we don't want to be doing that, as long as the things that we're doing are valuable for the business and for the user. If we flip back to this slide, we believe really firmly in making things that people want, and those people aren't necessarily the client, but the people who use the products. So in our early days, we had a stage in our process called Think. So we had a 3-stage process: Think, Design, Make. And Think was all about sort of understanding a couple of different things. Firstly, what are the stakeholder requirements from across the business to make sure that all parts of that organisation, departments have had their input into that product? And 2, it was validating those features with users so that essentially we could get to the end of our Think phase saying we've agreed on what this product or this project needs to be able to do. But it was a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we spent the time to get insights, but then by the time we get to the end of Think, we're a bit too far down the line to really change course. In other words, we're a bit oblivious, that's the link to the GIF, to the main question, which was, how do we know that this is the right thing to build? So we've done work to figure out what it is and how it works, but we really answered that first question of if we launch this thing, will it have the impact that we think it's going to have? Now, when I say we, I'm talking about the collective we. That's us as 383 and the client. Let's not forget that the client isn't a single person, but it's a whole business, an organisation. And by the time it's got down to us to be worked on, they've gone through multiple sort of stages of sign-off. So the business is pretty much committed to that idea. And it's really hard for us at that stage then to change course and to kind of do something different. So that was kind of like where we were sort of, I don't know, like 10, 11 years ago when I first joined 383. And what we needed is a way to be able to, I guess, course correct, for want of a better word, and to be a bit more agile in our approach. So here is, I kind of guess, the middle sort of phase of this journey. So the first bit was, there's some of the challenges that we see. creating things that don't really add as much value as they could do. How do we add more value? Maybe we go agile. So let's kind of rewind back to sort of 2013-ish time. Everyone's talking about agile. Like I think we had the lean startup, and Eric Ries was around that time, maybe a bit before that, in terms of popularity. But everyone was talking about agile, and clients were sort of using agile as the new buzzword, and agencies were falling over themselves to sort of say, "Look how agile I am." And also, it's becoming harder to differentiate our offering. We saw lots of other agencies sort of sounding like us, having similar processes, and we wanted to be able to stand out a bit more. So yeah, we started talking about being agile and doing agile, and really kind of to differentiate ourselves. And it was the kind of cool thing to do. But as we'll learn in the next few slides, it's not quite as easy as just us updating our proposition. The first thing we need to do is to get some agile knowledge. We were very used to working towards very tight specs and scopes of work, and switching from that to a more agile mindset was a culture shift, both for us internally and for our clients. So I went on an Agile and Scrum bootcamp, I think at General Assembly, got the basics, thought, yeah, I can see how this will fit in, brilliant. Let's now go and get the entire company trained. So we got the same people in, and we did sort of 2 days training where we got everybody, stopped all the projects, which was very expensive, and got them up to date with the concepts of sort of like agile, and the ceremonies, and how to do sprint planning and story estimating and all that kind of stuff. So great. There we started using Scrum. And at that point, we kind of had the knowledge, or so we thought, and we updated our creds decks. We got some new tools. I think we used Pivotal Tracker in the early days. That was before Jira and Trello were as big as they are now. And that was kind of like, that was it. We're like, let's go and get a client. The plan was pretty simple. Do that Scrum training, start setting sprints. So we created a sprint model where we had a different sort of rate card. We optimized our studio booking and process around being able to fit sprints in, and we wanted to reduce waste. And that waste was not just in terms of projects running over, because in our mind, if we sell sprints, when those sprints stop, that's it. But wasting effort in terms of building features that didn't add any value to anybody. So here we go. Not long after this, we got our first proper agile client. Time to celebrate. We were top of the moon. We thought, brilliant. We've done this. This is us now. But the client was actually another agency, and they were outsourcing the build part to us. And we were just really super excited to get started and put all of this theory that we'd got to practice. The first couple of sprints went really well, but then things didn't quite go to plan. So we completed our sprints, but all of the work wasn't done. And part of our statement of work was that the client pays their final invoice when they're happy with the deliverables. So from our perspective, we were working with our client, who was the agency, to get the work done. But the actual client, upon reviewing it, thought they'd been shortchanged because they'd signed off and agreed to a design. And whilst it was pretty close, you could do all the same bits of functionality, there were certain elements that were missing. And they thought they'd been shortchanged and that they hadn't got what they'd essentially paid for. So what were the lessons learned from this sort of first project? Well, first of all, we'd essentially done waterfall in sprints. We were shipping work every 2 weeks. And the only agility that really had was maybe the order in which we did things, but we were kind of committed to deliver it at that point. Second bit is we committed to design too early. Now, when I say we, that was the other agency and their client. The client thought that they were getting absolutely everything that they'd been shown, and they weren't really on board with the fact that some elements of fidelity might change. So you can probably see a lesson there. Third part was then stakeholder availability. So we worked really well with our client, but they didn't get their client involved in that process right until the very end, which meant there was no time then to make any changes or to actually make any updates. And fourthly, we were focused on delivery. So we weren't actually learning as we went through if the features that we were building were adding any level of value or if we were on the right track. We were just kind of like, yeah, great, let's just go ahead and build it. Now, that was just one example of that project. Over time, we obviously improved and optimized the way that we did that. But I would say until maybe two and a bit years ago, we were still really focused on delivery. We tuned and optimized the studio process, so i.e. once the work's been won, how do we deliver it? But we hadn't really nailed the bit up front. And we had a few projects whereby what the client thought they were buying at the start was different to what we discovered we needed to build. And actually what we found is that we needed to change our entire process all the way up to the very first conversation that we have when a prospect approached us wanting to work with us, all the way through to final delivery. So let's sort of fast forward a little bit more recently in terms of the product studio that we are today. How do we put some of these learnings or these lessons that we had into use? So we needed a new plan, one that would solve these problems of clients thinking they were buying something at the start, and then over time that thing changing. There was always that misalignment of objectives, and it needed to be compelling enough for clients to be able to procure it. So this plan had to be easy to digest. What essentially we're doing is we're selling time to the client. We're not then selling features. So how does the client really understand what it is that they're getting? We'll come on to that in a minute. It has to be compelling. So when we sell that time, there's always going to be another agency that can take a list and say, yep, I can build that in this amount of time for this amount of cost, regardless of whether or not they can or if they're the right things. So how do we kind of counteract that? We have to be outcomes focused. So we can't kind of get into the build trap straight away. We need to understand what change are we looking to make. It has to be relevant to 383. So it has to be true to our proposition of creating the right thing and creating the thing right. It has to be really collaborative, both between people within 383, so that's designers, engineers, QA, product, and the client's team as well. It's got to be actually agile. There's no point us talking about having a product studio if we're just going to go and have a kind of phased waterfall approach. We've got to be learning continuously as we go through. And that comes onto that discovery and delivery bit. It's also going to be time boxed. So, we are still an external party. We're still going to charge the client some money. It has to be able to fit within a certain amount of time so that we can cap that investment and the client knows that this isn't a never-ending kind of process initially. And then finally, it has to be valuable. The client's got to be able to see why what we do in our process is more valuable than what they might be used to. So while putting that new plan together, I can't remember exactly when, but quite a few years ago now, I read Inspired by Marty Kagan. And whilst not all of it was relevant to a studio like ours, there's a lot of learnings that came through, specifically around the types of risk present in product development and how to build teams to create products that customers love by reducing those risks. And this really is the first light bulb that went off in my mind. And these are the kind of 4 risks that Marty talks about in that book. So we've got desirability, whether or not customers will buy or use what we're putting in front of them. We've got usability, whether users can figure out how to use it. We've got feasibility, whether or not we can build it in the time, skills and technology that we have. And then we've got viability, whether or not that solution works for all aspects of the business. Now, what was interesting is when I sort of looked at this, the light bulb that went off is that we were focused quite a bit on usability. So we do a lot of usability testing, checking prototypes, a little bit on desirability up front. So validating that this concept is what customers actually want or people actually want. But feasibility was kind of, I guess, almost like our problem to go and solve. So that was just part of the process. And viability, we kind of left that to the client. Whether or not this would work for the client or not, or be valuable to their business, was kind of their challenge, really. But actually, if we looked at these 4 areas, we could then create quite a compelling proposition in terms of how 383 can position ourselves to reduce down those risks. So for that, we've got strategists that look at the viability of a proposition and figure out how it will work for them. And then depending upon the challenge that we've got coming in, one of the first things that we'll do is assess whatever proposition or idea across these areas of risk. And we'll use that then to build our program of work. So it might be that we actually need to do quite a bit more technical discovery because there's a big unknown around if a particular technology is A, going to be able to work, and B, give us the results that we want. There might be some work around desirability that we need to do. And the bit that's really interesting here is that this isn't just, do people want this thing? And sometimes our clients and prospects can get fooled with, well, there's a competitor over there doing it, so therefore that's validation that we can do it as well. Actually, what we need to do is figure out, do they want that from you? Does your brand have enough trust or equity that people want to be able to use your product? So we'll do some of that work as well. So really, this was the starting point of, actually, maybe we can get out of this idea of jumping straight into features, and we can explain to a client, part of what we're going to do is to reduce down these areas of risk in order to make sure that you've got a valuable product at the end of it. So the next thing I read was lean versus agile versus design thinking. And whilst this didn't necessarily teach me anything new, it helped to better frame a few bits that were kind of swimming around in my head. And then after that, read outcomes over outputs. And this, again, was another light bulb going off. In that book, they talk about a organization that spent years building something. They were using agile, they were doing user feedback and testing. They launched it and it's a complete and utter flop. So they thought they were taking the right process, but they were at the shooting for the wrong goal, essentially. So actually, together, these two books and the previous books helped to really shape a lot of how 383 operates today. And the key takeout is that our approach isn't just one thing, it's a collection of different things together to get us to a place where we need to be. So the first thing then is starting with an outcome. So now when anybody approaches 383 to work with us, the very first thing that we'll do is an outcomes workshop with them. So this is before we've even written a proposal or we've started to put any quotes together. Do an outcomes workshop, and that allows us to understand, client, you've come to us, or prospect, you've come to us with this proposition. What do you think, or what are you looking to be able to change? And explain to us the work that you've done in order to align how that proposition relates back to that outcome. And off the back of that, we then will have a number of different assumptions which we need to go and close down, and we can start to use those 4 areas of risk to then figure out what needs to get done. The next thing we do in terms of building the right thing is to be lean, to be really focused on getting something out there that we can start learning from as soon as possible. And then agile or scrum is our way then of delivering the thing. And it's all these 3 things together which make up the modern product development process that we've got at 383. So in terms then of some kind of final sort of lessons to leave you with, it will be this. First thing is always start with outcomes. Whether you're an internal team or an external team, understanding why you're doing something and what you're trying to achieve will make you focused on how do we then go and do that, not how do we go and introduce that feature or incorporate that feature into our roadmap. Lesson 2 is to map those risks and use that to create a plan of action. So as I said before, there's different levels of work that create value, and we need to get ourselves away from this idea that the only way of creating value is by shipping as many features as possible. It's about shipping the right features, and to do that, we need to understand the risks that are present. That might be that we need to spend a bit more time doing some user discovery up front to figure out, is this the thing that people are actually going to use? And that small amount of time can save us loads of time later on in the rest of the program. Lesson 3 is to ensure that you've got alignment all the way through the organisation. So for us as 383, as an external agency, it's about making sure that we're aligned within design, engineering, product, but also that the client and their stakeholders are aligned in terms of what they're getting as well. And this makes sure that you don't get any hiccups as you progress through it, or you don't get those kind of ad hoc requests that don't make any sense and don't align to anything. It's because probably that person isn't aligned with what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do it. Lesson 4 is don't commit too early. So again, internal, external team, don't commit until you know a few things. So first of all, is what we're working on, does it align to those outcomes, and can we see why it does? Are we sure that users want this thing? And are we sure that we can actually deliver it? There's no point signing up for something if we don't know how we're going to go and do that. So yeah, essentially don't commit too early. Lesson 5 is discovery, discovery, discovery. Always be learning. Teresa Torres talks about this in continuous discovery. And she talks about, ideally, you should be talking to your users once a week. Now, that's not always feasible. So let's say you're talking to them once a year, try and get that to once a quarter. If it's once a quarter, get that to once a month. If it's once a month, get that to once a sprint. And if it's once a sprint, get that to once a week. You can never have too much insight. However, make sure that you're taking that insight and using that to inform the direction and the fidelity of features that you're going to start shipping as part of that product. I won't go into that in detail here. Go and read Teresa's book. It's a really, really good read. And lastly, it's this one. It's strong opinions loosely held. So there'll always be times when we don't have enough data and insights to back up something, and we're just working on gut feeling, which is absolutely fine. But don't be too precious here. So, as a product manager, don't be so precious over that feature that sort of paralysis to make a decision blocks you from delivering value. But also, don't let your ego get hurt if your idea isn't the one that gets taken forward. What I'd say here is focus on doing enough to satisfy the requirement and then collect data to figure out if it's worked or not. And this is really quite key for us as 383 because there's a balance between shifting from the client telling us what to do and us having enough empowerment through data, insight, experience to be able to push back on the client, but also knowing that actually if the client wants something, let's do that. Let's figure out if it's worked or not. And if it hasn't, then the remedy is we need to do something else. It's not really worth kind of getting caught over. So that's me done. I'll leave you with this quote, which I think is brilliant. Modern product figures out what to build and then delivers it. And that really is kind of like how we operate at 383. Figuring out what is valuable, what should we do, and then how do we go and do it versus just being focused on the delivery part at the end of it. And that's me done. If you've got any questions, we can answer them now.
That's super. Thank you so much, Leon. That was extremely generous in sharing, I guess, where you've come from and really kind of sharing the under the hood kind of journey that you've gone on and what was the inspiration. I know when I was thinking ahead to this evening, one thing I was really curious about was, what was the real catalyst for you personally? What was your inspiration to help guide 383 through that transformation? But you've actually shared all of your secrets, I feel, there by sharing those books, which I'm sure all of the product community, some are familiar with, but absolutely, I agree. Those books are fantastic. Leon, a question from me to kick things off, and for those of you listening and watching in online, please feel free to throw in some questions into the comments. So Leon, at the Mind Product Conference last year, there was a speaker called Christian Iodi, and he really, what he said really struck a nail with me, and struck a chord with me, and it was every product problem is a people problem. So you've talked a lot about, the transformation, I guess, in terms of your processes and the way that you were working, the training that you embarked on. So what would you say your biggest challenge in the people space was in bringing people on that journey with you?
Yeah, great question. I think there's two things really. I think the first bit, if we look at internal first of all, then we'll look at the client side of things actually. So internal, it was this change from everybody having to step outside of their comfort zone. So we had to move from, I guess, engineering being at the end of the process and being quite used or expecting everything to have been agreed beforehand in order to build on, and actually having to then work upstream out of that comfort zone of absolute certainty. So I think that's one thing. The other part was then hiring product people into 383 when our proposition was quite different, I guess, to what we'd call client side. And it was this, in the early days, this idea that we're not actually completely empowered to make the decisions of what the client says. So as much as we talk about doing the right thing, ultimately that slave to the client. And I think that was the balance of how far do you push it, because ultimately we still are bound by contract and we're still a third party, and there's a really fine balance there between your personality getting in the way of that and getting frustrated that they haven't taken my idea, and then thinking, actually, the reason that they haven't taken that is we don't have enough evidence to be able to categorically prove something. I think there's quite a balance with that bit. So I think they're the hardest challenges, just I guess understanding that us as sort of, I guess, product consultants, it's slightly different to what you might read in the book, and it takes a little while, I think, for people to sometimes get that. I think then at the client side of things, it was definitely this idea of, well, what am I getting? And actually, it's a bit of a false sense of security when you've got a project plan, because I don't know about anybody else, but what plans ever go exactly as you thought it would do, right? But there's a level of comfort in knowing that if I sign up to a list of things and there's a Gantt chart that tells me when I'm going to get things, that I'll get that, whether or not that actually happens or not is a box ticking thing. Yeah. And I remember we had one client that said, I don't quite get these sprints that you're talking about. How do I know that you're not just sat around for half of this sprint doing nothing? And I was like, well, two things. One, how do you know that the estimate I've given you for that amount of time, I haven't just doubled it before I've given it to you? And he kind of stopped him in his tracks, and he thought, so I've got to trust that you guys are working on it. And I was like, well, there's trust, but then also you're part of the process. You're in our stand-ups, you're in our demos, you're in our planning. You can see the level of effort that goes into it. There's nowhere for us to hide, really. And I think it is full transparency on that.
So that real collaborative and communication, that skill set, actually, those soft skills really come to the front in terms of building that trust and transforming those relationships.
Absolutely. And I think actually that's the other bit with agency. You kind of have this this idea that everything's got to be perfect when you show it to the client. So there's that big reveal at the end of the project, and you can kind of reduce that by showing work in progress. But I think when you're working this way, you've got to be completely transparent. So there's going to be times when we've committed to something, but for whatever reason it hasn't quite gone there, and our job is to explain to the client why that didn't happen. So actually we assume that technology would work in this way and it hasn't actually worked in that way. That's not us being slower, but nobody knew those things. And I think if you try and hide that, that's when this relationship starts to fall down, and the client thinks you're hiding something. I think you've got to be completely open and transparent and treat their team and our team as one.
Right. Yeah, that sounds like a lovely dynamic that you have established.
When it works, it is, yeah.
We have some questions, Matt. I don't know whether you have a question, a burning question, but we do have lots of questions here in the comments.
Let's get to the comments questions.
Yeah. So let me see. So Aman, we have, how do you manage costs and budgets with your clients with this approach from an agency perspective?
Yeah, good question. So what we have is, so I guess if I rewind a little bit, so our ideal kind of project is one where we've got true agility, but we know that that isn't going to be the case for every single client. And we can't be, we're still running the business, right? So we can't be so choosy that we turn work away. But what we do need to be able to do, I guess, is make sure that it works within a process. So we've got kind of two models. One, which is a day rate, which we charge for normal projects where we've got enough insight and confidence that what we're estimating on is the right thing to do. And we can that's more of a traditional thing. The other way around is that we've got a sprint model where we have a blended day rate for the different people that are in a team. So that's product, QA, design, engineering. And based upon the project, we'll comprise a team, and that will give us a sprint cost. And then we'll sell a fixed number of sprints. So typically what we do is we sell 3 months worth, because what we don't want to do is get into that concept of how many sprints do we think we will take. Because essentially, again, we get back to that waterfall thing where we're trying to fit the project into 2-week chunks. Instead, we sell a period of time, and then we go through a process where we figure out, well, what's the outcome, and then what can we deliver within that time. And then that way, really, we've got to be really focused on maximizing value And there is no concept then of going over, because when that final sprint finishes, yes, there's things that we might do after, like support and maintenance, but that bit's done. And if we're running over, it's because we haven't managed that process properly enough, really.
So is your end game, I guess, to when you're planning work with your clients, just to expand on it, I'm trying to anticipate what Eamon might be asking you back. So do you, would you look at a client and say, okay, well, we're going to cost 3 months of work and sell you 3 months of work, but actually really what we're hoping is that this is going to be a year-long partnership?
Yeah.
And you're proving that value in the first 3 months to build that credential to get the rest.
Yeah, absolutely. So it can be in different ways. So again, we're quite transparent up front with clients in terms of where are they now and where do they want to get to. So it might be that we're working with a startup and they need to quickly get something to market whilst they hire. So we might come in for that 3 month period of time, figure out what we think that product is, launch the first version of it, and then transition that back into their team. Other clients might not have any digital capability at all, and therefore we're signing up for a longer term contract. And we say to them, let's get something out to market first of all, and then continue that on. But we always make sure there's some kind of transition plan off the back of it. But the idea is that we're not trying to sell individual projects where they're kind of, we've estimated it up front. We're trying to sell those units of time.
I think this topic ties in well to Neve's question in the comments, actually, where she's wondering if you've turned away potential clients because they haven't bought into the process that you use. Yeah,
well, so I guess it's both ways. So there is one client that we turned down last year in the middle of lockdown when, you kind of think, well, you need to get any work in, but actually that client was kind of off the old mindset of, well, you're the agency and I won't pay you until I'm happy, and therefore I'm going to squeeze as much out of you as I possibly can, without any appreciation of, are these things even valuable or not? And one thing that we will never try and do is force the client to work our way. If they don't feel that they can work in this way, ultimately it's going to become unstuck at some point. So sometimes you have to walk away from it. On the flip side, there are some clients, again, that want that sort of comfort of knowing exactly what they're going to get, even though they can't quite articulate or scope out what it is that they're asking for in the first instance. So what we try and do to combat that is through all of our content that we put out, the events that we do, is trying to attract the clients that think in that way, but also don't force it. Because at some point, it's going to come back and not work, really.
Super. We have Monica. So Monica was showing some appreciation for the books you were sharing earlier. Monica, you're asking, what are some techniques you use to achieve alignment with stakeholders, and do you bring them into the discovery process?
Yeah. So again, another good question. In terms of the discovery process, so I mentioned this idea of the outcomes workshop. So this is something that we do almost as the first meeting that we have. So let's say we get a client approach us and they want to work with 383. We'll have an outcomes workshop, and at that point we stipulate that anybody that's got any involvement or control over the product is there at that meeting. So that might be C-suite people, because it's important for us that we understand why the clients come to us with that concept. So some clients, they say, we need an app to do X. Okay, why do you think it's an app? What is the app trying to get done? And what we can do is we can start to tease out at that point, actually, what you're trying to achieve is an increase in engagement with your platform, your content. Let's figure out if that's the right way of doing that. If it is, great, let's carry on. If it's not, how might we solve that in a different way? And if we don't have those people in the room at that point, you then get this kind of diluted message back and forth where it's not quite clear what we're trying to get done. And ultimately, as the project progresses, that sort of gap gets wider, and you ultimately end up then with something at the end that stakeholder wasn't expecting. And that's where these kind of problems creep in. So, depending then on as that sort of program of work progresses, that key stakeholder might not be in every single meeting. So we don't expect them to be in, if they're the CEO, in like daily stand-ups. What we do say is you have to be there at every demo. So once we've got something to show, you need to be there to see it. Therefore, there's no sort of big reveal, big surprise at the end. In terms of that alignment, it's all about really mapping those outcomes and questioning, is everything that we're doing getting us closer to that outcome, yes or no? And always, the thing that we have to be mindful of is sometimes the CEO has an idea. We had this a couple of weeks ago. I'm absolutely certain about this feature. And we can say, is that the right thing to do? We can present some data. But ultimately, if they're that sure about it and they're willing to take the risk on, it's not about fighting with them. It's about sort of letting that feature come in, but monitoring it and tracking it and figuring out ultimately, did it add value? And if it didn't, and we can prove that, you've then got some, I guess, some buy-in for the next time that you kind of challenge them, for them to have a little think. So sometimes it's like play the long game with that as well. Which I'm sure, isn't a surprise to many people.
Yeah, I think we've all had that experience.
Absolutely.
So there's another question from Titus. So it's there's actually two questions. So how do you deal with unpredictable outcomes for clients with products for new niche markets? And then do you align more with clients' desired outcomes or the user's outcomes in getting that problem solved?
Cool. Good question. I want to answer the last bit first, I think, and then come back. So in terms of whose outcomes do we align with, the business or the user? I guess for us, it will depend really. So let me give you an example of that. Sometimes clients come to us at various stages. So sometimes it's, we've done some insight, we've done some research, we're really sure that this is the right thing to do, but we might need to get some help in terms of what the features are. Other times clients will come to us with an understanding that they've got problems with their current experience. And what we then do is understand, well, what are the outcomes that you're seeking as an organization? And that might be to reduce the amount of customer service requests that come in. It might be to improve the customer experience, whatever that might be. And we can quantify that normally with some numbers. We will then go and understand from the customer's perspective what is wrong with that experience. We'll map all the different frictions and we'll start to understand, well, what are the jobs that people are actually trying to get done in the first instance that they couldn't get done that resulted in them having a poor experience. So we'll have these two kind of ideas of customer jobs and business outcomes. And then it's about using like an ideation process to figure out, well, what could the product be that connects those two things together? And that's where we might then need to go through some experimentation, some kind of rapid prototyping and testing different concepts out until we can get to an idea where we can say, actually, is this the thing that solves enough problem for the customer and also is viable for the business? And then at that point, that then might fall out into a product, yeah. So hopefully that answers that. In terms of things into niche markets, I guess it's through probably doing more research into that desirability part that we mentioned in terms of the risk area to give us that confidence.
Sounds like a lot of complication and risk. I think that ties into. Oh, sorry, Janice. I was gonna say that ties into Eamon's question of how do you manage costs and budgets with your clients with this approach from an agency perspective?
Yeah, and I think those costs really are about us. Talking about, well, what are we doing with that time and having controls in there. So things aren't never ending. There's the time boxed, and that time box really is the level of comfort that the client is willing to invest to figure out if they can reach their outcomes essentially, and that's where we try and position it. So it's not a never-ending sort of like pot of money, and really what we're looking to do is build up that trust that if for whatever reason something didn't work, we understand why it didn't work, and therefore what else could work. But it's about figuring that out before we run out of time and money really.
Makes sense.
There's a question here that I would really love answered. And it is, how do you handle the excited CEO?
I mean, I think I touched on it a little bit before, but I think it's about understanding really like a couple of different things. And one is they're the CEO for a reason. And that is probably based upon this idea that they are right a lot of the time. But I think it's about making sure that we understand what they really want to achieve. So things like running 5 whys with them to kind of understand, well, you come to with this feature, like let's go back and understand why. And that really gets us to the outcome. And then it might be running a small sort of like session to figure out, well, is there any other ways that we could explore this problem? And then it's about kind of balancing their kind of personality, really. So if there's a shared understanding that this thing might not work, but they're willing to take that risk on, then so be it. But if they can't really articulate why they're doing something, I think it's our job as product to kind of get that gap closed down, and to get them to see that, and get them to articulate, well, if this thing works, I expect this to happen. If they can't do that bit, I think that's when you can kind of have a bit more license to work with them until they can get there. But also, and I think for as an agency, we've got to sort of remind ourselves of like what we're there to do. So, we're there to be custodians of the product and to help do the right thing and reduce waste and maximize value. But sometimes you do need to kind of just do what the CEO says. What I would say then, if you are getting lots of requests coming through, there probably is a breakdown between what they, having an idea is easy. Obviously, execution is difficult. So actually probably trying to open their eyes to the level of detail that is involved in taking what they think is a one-line email, or it'd be great if we could do X, into, well, okay, in order for that to happen, this is what we need to be able to do, and showing them that, because over time, what we found is they start to appreciate, oh, okay, actually, there's a bit more to this. And I think communicate that. I think that when you don't communicate it and you go away and do it, it looks easy, and therefore the expectation is, well, I can keep giving you more things to do. And then I think finally on that, it's about being able to collate these features together somewhere. So whether or not you've got a spreadsheet, whether or not you've got some other kind of tool, product board, I might have just gone blank on the other tools, but yeah, collect those somewhere, and then review those on a regular basis and be like, well, look, we've only got this amount of resource, whatever that might be, if that's time, if that's people, which are the most important things that you think you'd like us to go and work on. But again, make sure that you understand the outcome that you're seeking with all those things as well. So yeah, that's kind of how we manage it. Yeah, I think that answers it.
It's actually interesting you hear saying all of that. Rich Mironoff published one of his articles this week, and he talked about how to articulate that actually to what you've just said to C-suite stakeholders, and really capturing and documenting, well, if we do this feature that you want us to do, communicating the impact and how it will impact on all of the other things that are there, and just being able to really document that in black and white.
Yeah,
and communicate it very well.
I think things like, what we tend to find is like people, when they're at the level of the CEO, they sort of see like a surface level. So, it's just adding a button in for argument's sake, but actually what they don't quite grasp is, well, yeah, creating the button's easy, but what does the button do? What's it need to connect to? What data is it pulling? What's it trying to achieve? And a really simple way of doing that is just to sketch out like a quick user story map, and to sort of show, well, if everything, here's our happy path, but we need to consider the unhappy path. And it starts to get those cogs whirring a little bit then, in terms of, actually, this isn't quite as simple as I thought it would be. It doesn't mean that that problem goes away, but there's a bit more of appreciation of, well, why does it take so long? Well, for all these reasons, really.
Yeah, that's something I'm going to borrow. You doing a quick user story map. That's a really good tip. So yeah, so I guess there's one question that we'll finish off on, which is what happens if you run out of time and you haven't completed everything within a sprint?
Oh, yeah, good. I would say that it's a big failure on our side, really. So I guess when I mentioned before, we time box that amount of time. Obviously, we don't have 12 weeks completely to go and build. We can't build up into the last minute. But what we do have to do is to make sure that we've got a really clear understanding of like the outcomes, and there might be multiple outcomes, and what's most important, and that we've got review points along the way, so that we can kind of make sure that what we're releasing is valuable, and that we don't kind of get to a point where we've half built something and we can't release it. So it is really about a couple of different things, really. Understanding what's the most important thing to work on. B, it's then thinking about how do you break that down, and don't overcommit to a feature. So what's the minimum that we can build in order to start learning? And then C, it's about having when I say a roadmap, a theme-based roadmap. So not talking about sort of like when we have dates in there, so that we can say, actually, that's not going to happen now. That might have to happen later. And I think we still do need to have some kind of a project plan so that we can complete whatever things we need to do to go live, but we need to give ourselves enough time. So it's about having a cutoff where we're not having any new features and we're going into refinement, and therefore we're launching it. And that ensures that we don't run out of time, and then we have an incomplete product that we can't ship, really. So yeah, what we can't do is throw it through then is go back to the client and say we're out of time, we haven't got anything, because that's a big failure collectively, but really our failure as the kind of like experts of running that process, I guess.
That's great, thank you, Leon. So what we will do is, I guess it's actually a nice introduction what you've just done there, talking about roadmaps, because I'll wrap up and just share a little bit about next month. But firstly, to say a huge thank you again, to say you've been very, very generous with your knowledge and with your insights. And I've certainly taken away a lot of tips and tricks from what you've shared this evening. So next month, I will just switch over to, sorry, just 1 second, to what's happening next month. So next month, Matt will be hosting the event, and Bill Wagner from Penta Technologies will be doing a talk, and his talk is all based around roadmaps. And the title of the talk is, which Top Gear personality are you when you're driving your roadmap? So that's happening on Wednesday, the 21st of July, between 7 and 8 p.m. Again, broadcasting live here on Mind the Products YouTube channel. So yeah, just to wrap up and again say thank you, Leon. And yeah, hopefully get to see you in person sometime soon.
Thanks, Leon.
Cheers. Thanks for having me.
Good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.